was not exhausted by the miles, but seemed to thrive on them. There was an empty seat in the front opposite the driver, and Joe sat up there smoking for a while, fascinated by what was taking place between the bus and the highway. The way the highway seemed to enter it underneath, all these miles disappearing into an enormous machine, and the machine all the while seeming to get leaner and more fit. Before returning to his own seat, Joe wanted to make some remark to the driver. "It's a powerful mother, ain't it?" But the driver didn't look up. Walking back toward his own seat, Joe felt like a circus performer dancing on horseback. This great being through whose center he moved had something in common with himself, but Joe was little better equipped to think about it than was the bus itself. He felt it, though, some kind of masterful participation in the world of time and space, a moving forward into destiny. Back in his own seat, he smiled at this new sense of himself and blew a kiss at his new boots, and before long his eyes were closed and he was sleeping the deep black sleep of a creature who has not yet been born. The first half of Joe's big trip east was passed in this way. Sometimes his eyes were open, but even at such intervals he dreamed himself into whatever landscape he was passing through, still so confident of himself and his future that he gave them scarcely a passing thought. It was on the afternoon of the second day, the day on which at 5 p.m. his arrival was to take place, that Joe became somewhat fretful. Perfection had begun to arouse his suspicions. It occurred to him that he might be embroiled in some colossal confidence game in which he was both victim and perpetrator. For instance, exactly what the hell was he going to do in New York City? He kept glancing above him, taking reassurance from the presence of his black and white horsehide suitcase and all the fine articles it contained, and every few minutes he touched the hip on which his money rode. He searched the faces of other passengers, wondering if someone among them was a potential ally, or if they were all strangers like himself, uneasy at the prospect of arrival in the richest and tallest of all cities. The last rest stop was at a Howard Johnson's in Pennsylvania. Joe took his suitcase with him into the men's room and spent the 20 minutes grooming himself for his arrival in New York City. He shaved, splashed himself with Florida water, changed into a fresh shirt, and gave a quick spit shine on his boots. Even though there were other men using the facilities, Joe could not resist using the mirror in his own peculiar way. He walked away from it, prepared his expression, his attitude, then spun around to surprise his image. What he saw was tremendously comforting to him. When he clicked out of that men's room, other passengers were already returning to the bus. Two very young girls, occupants of seats near the front of the bus, who had been keenly aware of Joe Buck's presence throughout the trip, were climbing aboard just ahead of him. One of them, stimulated by his proximity, giggled breathlessly. Joe was as pleased as he could be. As he passed their seat, he tipped his Stetson and allowed them full benefit of the sweet, crooked smile he had developed. Their reaction was wild and hysterical. For miles, in a kind of heavenly hell of painful titillation, the girls stifled screams hid behind damp handkerchiefs and struck each other. Joe was reassured and couldn't remember what he'd been worried about, what to do when he got to New York. Shit! What could be simpler? Head for Times Square and follow his nose. Suddenly, up ahead was the Manhattan skyline, buildings like markers in a crowded graveyard. Joe's hand moved to his crotch, and under his breath he said, "I'm gonna take hold of this thing, and I'm gonna swing it like a lasso, and I'm gonna rope in this whole fucking island." 2. At the Times Square Palace Hotel, Joe was conducted to his room by a shriveled old bellhop who called him "Sir" a number of times and carried his suitcase for him. Joe gave him $1 and then closed the door and examined the room. It was twice as expensive as the place in Houston, but many times more pleasant, and it had a private bath as well. The walls had been freshly greened. The bedspread was spotlessly clean, tan in color. The furniture was maple. Over the bed was a watercolor of the Manhattan skyline, and next to the bed, a telephone on a stand. Joe believed himself to be in a first-class situation. He unpacked, placing his radio on the bedside table. Then he lighted a cigarette and sat at a small desk in front of the window, looking back and forth in amazement at his two new worlds. 42nd Street out there, throbbing and rich and noisy, and this place inside where his hat would hang and where his head would rest. He sat for a long time studying the bureau, and for one crazy moment he found himself unable to believe that his personal belongings were still there, even though he himself had just placed them there. For that brief moment, he was convinced that when something was out of sight, it lost its existence altogether. He hurried across the room and looked into the mirror. It was a relief to find that he himself was still there, but he was not entirely certain until he had waved and smiled at his image and blown a cloud of smoke at it. Then he rechecked the drawers of the bureau and the closet. Reassured, he crossed the room again, stopping to smile once more at his reflection in the mirror, saying, "Now you take it easy, cowboy. You're all settled in here, about to get rich." He performed a little hip dance mimicking copulation and returned to the desk to finish smoking his cigarette. "New York City," he said, looking at the street. A fat, incredibly sloppy old woman sitting on the sidewalk under a movie marquee across the street poured something from a bottle onto her filthy, naked feet and rubbed them with her free hand. No one paid much attention to her. A policeman watched with some interest but no concern, and then moved on. "Your room," he said to his radio. He went over and turned it on, hoping its sounds would give him the feeling of having truly arrived in this new place. A woman's high-pitched, somewhat hysterical voice was saying, "And that's my system." Then she giggled. A man's voice with a special electronic fervor in it said, "Well, that beats anything I've ever heard. When you have insomnia, you simply get out of bed." "Yes," shrieked the woman, losing control of herself. "What on earth do you do?" the man urged. "I turn on my lights," she said breathlessly, "and I get dressed, and I do my work. Maybe even cook something, or bake." Seemingly overcome, the woman was unable to continue speaking. rumors about Eastern women. Aloud, he said, "What's wrong with you, lady? It's perfectly clear to me. Get me over to that radio station. I'll put you in shape." "Of course," the woman said. "I'll probably collapse right here at this microphone." Then she gave way to utter breathless hysteria. "Well," said the announcer, chuckling fatuously, "I hope you won't collapse until you've sung for us." He played a record on which the woman, in a quieter mood and through an echo chamber, sang "My Foolish Heart." While she sang, Joe opened the desk drawer. He found a ballpoint pen and 2 postcards picturing this very hotel. After some study, he was able to determine which of the windows was his own. Encircling it with the pen, he turned the card over and wrote "Dear" in the message space. Then he stopped writing, wondering, dear who? Unable to think of a name to place there, he tore the card in half and dropped it out the window. The lady on the radio sang that this time it wasn't fascination, this time it was love. Joe picked up the second card, encircling his own window again, and wrote, "This is me," across the sky. And on the message side, skipping the dear part entirely, he wrote, "Well, I am settled in here. New York is not so much, but I have got my own place, and very clean too." In the space intended for the addressee, he printed the word "shit." Then he tore the card in half and said, "I'm fucked if I come to this town to write postcards." Just as he threw the pieces of the card out the window, he thought of someone to whom he might have addressed it, his Negro colleague in the scullery of the Sunshine Cafeteria. He put his head out the window and saw the fragments still floating toward the street. For a moment, it looked as if one of them might drop right into the cap of a loitering sailor, but the sailor moved on, joining a stream of early evening pedestrians. 3. Joe adjusted his pace so that he and the rich lady might arrive at the corner at the same moment. With luck, the light would be red, and they would wait there together, and somehow a conversation would begin in which the rich lady would be afforded an opportunity to place a bid on his wares. Park Avenue was not what he had expected. Of the few persons walking here at twilight, not one had given him a second glance. His faith in himself and his project was a delicate thing at best, and he had now to be especially agile in avoiding any doubt that might bump up against it and wreck it entirely. For instance, there was no single aspect of this rich lady he followed that might suggest any hunger for what he had to offer, but he knew that if he pondered even for a moment her flawless, elegant self-sufficiency, evident in every detail of her appearance and in every step she took, his own resolve would be lost to him at once. She was a small-boned, brown-haired lady of medium height. As she preceded him down Park Avenue, Joe admired her ankles. They were slender, beautifully formed, and they seemed to say, "We are not very strong, but we are strong enough and rich." At the corner of 39th Street, waiting for the light, Joe removed his hat and held it over his heart. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he said, putting many facial muscles to work on a powerful smile. "I'm new here in town, just in from Houston, Texas, and looking for the Statue of Liberty." The rich lady continued to present him with a perfect view of her profile, a what you do. Let me see. You take the subway, I'm almost sure of this, the 7th Avenue subway, and you get off at the end of the line. Oh, but I'm not really certain. You'd better ask someone else. Play it safe, don't you think? Joe was so taken with the lady, he hardly listened to the words she spoke. But each of them, as formed by her lips, seemed to him a miracle of beauty. You sure are a pretty lady, he said, surprising himself. The lady turned to him quickly, taken aback and blushing in a way that thrilled him. Oh, she said, trying to frown, but she was clearly not a frowner. You're not looking for the Statue of Liberty at all. No, ma'am, he said, I'm not. Why, that's perfectly dreadful. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? She began to smile, increasing the number of lines in her face and intensifying the blue and the twinkle and the sympathy of her eyes. This face, especially these remarkable eyes, seemed to be saying, you and I are wonderful people who understand all the beautiful things of the world that are lost to others. But now that we have had this greatly amusing and secret moment, it is time for us to part. Aloud, she simply said goodbye and walked away from him. He watched her leave, noting that her trim rear end was now intensely conscious of itself. This pleased him. It also caused a disturbance in his stomach. He had always been an appreciator of the walking away of certain women, the way they had of switching the fanny from side to side in such a carefully measured way, and yet holding the head so high you were supposed to believe the thoughts in it were 7,000 miles north of the Arctic Ocean, and as cool. But now, along with the enjoyment, Joe Buck felt this weakness and anxious churning deep in his body. He had to tighten the muscles in his thighs in order to remain standing, and his toes gripped the soles of his boots. Cute lady, he said aloud, but very softly, as he watched her proceed up 37th Street. Rich, too, he said, following her slowly on the opposite side of the street and admiring her more with every step she took. Too bad she ain't the buying kind, he said, watching her turn and walk up the steps of a great brownstone house. He watched her open the front door, and he watched her enter the bowels. And then he made a sound that was not a word at all, as something cold and awful touched his heart. Her door had closed. He sat on a nearby stoop and continued watching the place, wondering at the nature of his sudden new suffering. And then the dark windows on the parlor floor, silently and softly, exploded into light. This light was the color of amber and warm as flesh, but Joe had no notion of why it hurt him so to look at. He only knew for certain that the twilight had ended and it was time for a good long drink of liquor. He forced himself to his feet and began to walk, and pretty soon he came upon another kind of rich lady altogether. 4. The second rich lady was walking a white French poodle on Lexington Avenue in the 30s. Joe found her looking at some yellow pom-poms in front of a florist window. The poodle was so small it looked like a wind-up toy, but the lady herself was very large. She was like some movie star you'd read about who had wrecked her career with food. She was brunette. Her eyelashes stuck out a good shimmy away up Lexington Avenue in her tight black dress and pink high-heeled shoes, the little dog racing to keep pace with her. At the traffic light, she looked back, held the cowboy's eye for a count of 4, smiled, and then stooped to pick up the dog and disappeared around the corner, mouthing elaborate baby talk at the tiny beast trapped in the crook of her arm. Joe hurried to the corner where he could see her waiting for him under the canopy of an apartment house. The lady, confident that he was following, proceeded into the building. In a moment, Joe passed through a pair of solid gold doors, perhaps not solid gold, but covered with some gold-colored metal that made you feel once you passed through them that money was no longer a problem. He stepped into a carpeted elevator where the rich lady was looking straight ahead of her as if she had no notion of his existence. But the minute those doors had made their soft, expensive little kaloosh sound of closing, Joe's lips were being licked by the long tongue of the rich lady, who was also rubbing her stomach against his. Then, even though she was a very large person, she smiled as if she were very small and said, "Hi." Joe shivered. The poodle yapped. There was another kaloosh, and they stepped off the elevator into a private apartment with fluffy white carpets. The rich lady took hold of his hand. "I got to make a couple of phony phones," she said, pulling him along behind her toward a white and gold desk where there was a telephone. Dialing with one hand, she unbuttoned Joe's trousers with the other and began to work with the zipper. The entire episode was taking place with a speed and style far more amazing than Joe's best fantasies. "Cass Trehune," said the rich lady into the telephone, her left hand by now busy inside Joe's trousers. "Any messages?" "Who is this?" "Imelda." "Hello, sweetheart. Anything for me?" "Needleman, right? Got it. How long ago?" "I said when." "Okay, what is it?" "The Murray Hill 5. No, never mind. I've got it, Imelda. I've got the damn thing, honey, you know. Thanks, bye." Still holding the receiver, she disengaged the connection with her thumb. Then she looked down to examine what she had found with her left hand. "Ye gods," she said, impressed, and hung on to it as she dialed the Murray Hill number. "Mr. Needleman, please." There was a pause in which she let go of Joe, lifted her skirt, turned around and backed against the front of him, guiding his arms around her waist. "Oh, hello, Mr. Palmbum. What are you doing there?" "Fine, thanks. Sensational, in fact. Put Maury on, would you?" There was another pause. She put her ear in Joe's mouth. "Oh, stop. Oh, God," she said. "I can't stand that. I just die." "Maury?" Her voice went soft and sweet. It seemed to be luring some small child into a gas chamber with promises of candy. "Oh, Maury. Hi. I got your call. I was walking baby." "No, sweetie, I haven't been out, but just that once. I mean, him't got to do him't goody good, right?" "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I did walk him once earlier, about 3. But, sweetie, I checked with the service, and there wasn't a thing, honest." "Well, you didn't leave a message, did you?" "All right. size of the woman, and delighted to discover that the place of his first employment was an actual penthouse. He chased her about the terrace until she allowed herself to be caught leaning breathless against a low wall that protected her from a drop of some 15 stories. "Shh," she said, looking upward, her forefinger against her lips. "Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. Wish I may, wish I might, have the wish I wish tonight." There! Now she was bending over the wall, her belly resting on top of it in a way that invited Joe to step up behind her. "Oh, oh, she said. I'm so afraid, I'm so afraid, I'm so afraid of heights." Joe had one of her buttocks in each of his hands, enjoying their doughy pliability. "I won't let you get away from me," he said, taking one slow, deep, final step towards the rich lady. "Ye gods!" she cried out. "What are you doing? That's a terrible thing to do. I've never heard of such a—" And then she stopped talking. Joe took one long north-to-south look at the great island Manhattan, and then he happened to look upon himself, here on the roof of one of its tall buildings under the stars, naked, joined to a woman, and he was moved deeply by a sudden keen awareness of the moment. It was as if he himself were one person, and the one he dreamed of being were another, and these two had been traveling separate paths until here and now, on this terrace. And on this night, the two were merged. He paused in his activity to contemplate the marvel of this meeting with himself, and his eyes filled over with tears. He was having a moment of happiness, and then the rich lady moved in a way that caused his attention to return to the matter at hand. 5. Now, Joe's first assumption about Cass Treyun's financial condition had been based somewhat recklessly upon two factors: the tinniness of her dog, it must cost a fortune to keep that little thing breathing, and the number and size of the rhinestones at her wrists, which he mistook for diamonds. The estimate had been further sustained by another shaky notion that anyone living in a penthouse had to have even more money than an archbishop. Therefore, at a few minutes past 11, while Cass was showering in preparation for her midnight rendezvous with Needleman, Joe consulted himself in the bedroom mirror. "Say, Cass," he rehearsed aloud, "I want to tell you, I've had as good a time here tonight as I've ever had, and that's a goddamn fact. It's why I hate to bring up this business thing." Judging this to be a fairly poor beginning, he stopped and began to on a new tack. "Hey, you beautiful thing." He leaned with both hands on the dressing table and swung his eyes onto the image in the glass. "Can you let me have 20? "Oh, sure, baby," said a little voice in his mind. "Take 50, although God knows you're worth 100. He pursed his lips and sent a kiss into the mirror, and then smiled at it again. Cass came tiptoeing in from the bathroom, fully made up, but still naked, in some curious moods of afterbath modesty. She held the towel in front of her. "Don't look," she said, heading for the closet. "Say, Cass," said the cowboy, "I sure have enjoyed being here tonight." "Me too, lover," came the voice from behind the closet door. "Believe it's as fine a time as I've had in my life." A moment later, a tower of black bugle beads and ivory came backing toward him. "Zip this thing up, will you, Tex?" Joe zipped her dress for her. Then he said, seemed preoccupied. "You're plenty different in Maury," she said. "In lots of other ways, too. Believe you me." She studied herself in the glass, finding some flaw in her mouth. She picked up a lipstick paper. "Matter of fact," Joe said, wondering whether or not he could get the next words out, "I'm a hustler." "There," she said, stretching her upper lip across her teeth and smearing it with orange. "Herson soda Mega 11. Beg pardon?" She relaxed her mouth and replaced the cap on the lipstick. "Said a person's got to make a living." Joe laughed. "You sure you heard what I said?" Cass gave no answer to this, but Joe was encouraged. When she rose from the dressing table and went to a chest of drawers, where she took out a gold lame evening bag. "Excuse me, hon," she said. "Afraid I'm only half here. Maybe you ought to run on along." She opened the evening bag. Joe was thrilled. He sat on the edge of the bed and tried to hide his pleasure by fooling with the tops of his boots. From the corner of his eye, he saw her come toward him and stop, lowering the bag to a level with his eyes. It was wide open, and it was empty. "Tex," she said, "could you let me have a little coin for the taxi-waxy? I didn't get to the bank this afternoon." She cupped his chin in her hand and looked down at him seductively. "You're such a doll," she said. "I hate money. Don't you? God, it's been fun. Why don't you take this phone number anyway?" The shock went deep, but Joe's recovery was quick. He laughed weakly and said, "Funny thing, you mentioning money. I was about to ask you for some." He started to cover this request with another small laugh, but the sound froze in his throat along with the air in the room and everything else in the place. There was a long, dangerous moment of locked eyes. Finally, in an impassioned whisper, the woman still holding his chin said, "You want money from me, huh? You asking me for money, is that it? Is that what you're doing, asking me for money?" For Joe, an act of speech would have been impossible, but apparently Cass found some answer in his eyes. "You prick," she said, hurting his chin. "You bastard, you son of a bitch. You think you're dealing with some old slut? Look at me, 31. You think 'cause you're hung, you can get away with this crap? Well, you're out of your mind. I'm a gorgeous chick. 31, that's right. You said it. I'd like to kill you in cold blood." Tears suddenly squirted from her eyes, and then she screamed and threw herself on the bed, saying, "I've never in my life," and other phrases that could not be understood because some of her fingers were in her mouth. Joe got to his feet. He had no notion of what to say or do. He lit a cigarette, put the match in an ashtray, and pulled a lot of smoke into his lungs. He stood over the woman, studying her body for some clue as to how he might behave. Her bare shoulders heaved with sobs, giving her the look of a beached whale in its death throes. It amazed him that sadness could so increase a person's bulk. "Hey," Joe said, sitting on the bed next to her. "Hey, Cass." He put his hand on her back, rocking her gently to and fro. "Did you think I meant that? About the money? Why, that wasn't nothing but a big joke. Shoot, and here I thought you had a wonderful sense of humor. Shows how wrong I was." Then he got up, pretending to dismiss her. "Ah, you just putting on. You not caring. You're not crying at face, Cass. Gets a guy all horny just looking at you. She opened